The unseen hurt in those who feel easier to replace than remember ***. There is a quiet kind of ache that rarely makes a sound. It belongs to the people who walk through life carrying the strange belief that they are forgettable, that their presence is temporary, that the world moves on too quickly after them. They are the ones who laugh softly in groups but never feel fully inside the moment. The ones who withdraw before anyone can notice they were there. The ones who learned, somewhere along the way, that being replaced hurts less than being remembered and left behind. This is the story of that unseen hurt, the invisible bruise beneath the calm exterior, the psychology of those who feel easier to forget than worth holding on to. There are moments a person never forgets, even if they pretend they do. Small, almost invisible scenes, like being the child who waited a little longer than everyone else to be picked up, or the teenager whose birthday passed quietly because no one remembered the date, or the young adult who realized every group chat moved on without noticing their silence. For people who grow up believing they are easier to replace than to remember, the story rarely begins with one dramatic wound. It starts with the soft, repeated echo of absence. A pattern of being overlooked. A series of tiny emotional misses that accumulate like dust in a corner, unnoticed but heavy. They learn early that presence is fragile. That their existence in someone's world feels conditional, temporary. That affection arrives with an expiration date they can never quite see. And so, long before they understand words like validation or attachment, they begin shaping themselves around a quiet fear that they are forgettable. Some children grow up in homes where love exists but attention does not. Parents may be busy, overwhelmed, distant, present in body, absent in emotional presence. These children learn that the world rarely pauses for them. They wait at the edges of conversations. They adapt to the moods of others. They become careful observers of everyone's needs except their own. Others grow up in families where affection is inconsistent. Warm sometimes, cold other times, a rhythm they can never predict. When love is intermittent, the mind forms an unspoken belief. If I am not perfect, they won't stay. A belief that follows them into every future relationship, shaping how they walk, talk, and connect. And some discover forgettability through social dynamics, being the friend included only when convenient, the student no one sits with unless the seats are full, the sibling overshadowed by louder personalities. These early social imprints do not scream. They whisper. They settle into the bones like a quiet expectation. From the outside, these individuals often appear composed, soft-spoken, agreeable, gentle. But inside, a subtle ache forms. It's the ache of learning too early that they must shrink themselves to be tolerated, not expanded to be loved. So they become the child who never asks for more. The teenager who hides disappointment under a smile. The adult who convinces themselves that wanting to be remembered is asking for too much. People often misinterpret this quietness. They assume it's confidence, or independence, or introversion. But the truth is gentler and sadder. It is the reflex of someone who grew up believing that attachment is fragile, and they are the first thing to fall through the cracks. This is how the identity of replaceable is formed. Not through one wound, but through hundreds of micro-moments where a person felt unchosen. Psychologically, these experiences mark them in subtle ways. The brain records emotional patterns long before the mind understands them. When a child consistently feels unseen, the nervous system adapts. It learns to expect absence. It learns to prepare for being overlooked before it happens. This becomes a survival strategy, to detach first, to need less, to appear fine. And yet, beneath all this adaptation lies a longing so simple it almost feels dangerous. The desire to matter. To someone. Anyone. In a way that feels lasting. But when a person grows up believing they are forgettable, longing becomes risky. Because hope is heavier than disappointment. Because being remembered means there is something to lose. Because being valued means there is something that can break. And so, they spend years, sometimes decades, learning how to exist quietly, safely, invisibly. Never because they want to be invisible, but because they learned that being visible often leads to hurt. What begins as a childhood adaptation slowly becomes an adult identity. It colors how they interpret relationships. It shapes how they show up for love, for friendship, even for themselves. And though the world may never notice the silent weight they carry, they feel it every time someone forgets to reply, every time their absence goes unnoticed, every time they realize they are the least remembered person in a room full of people. This chapter is the beginning of that story, the first echo of absence that shaped their understanding of themselves. Not a flaw. Not a weakness. But a learned response to a world that didn't always look back when they reached out. By the time a person reaches adulthood, the belief of being easy to replace no longer feels like a fear. Feels like a fact. a quiet rule life has always followed. But beliefs like these don't appear out of thin air. They are built, layer by layer, experience by experience, until the mind begins treating them as truth. This chapter explores that blueprint, the psychological architecture behind feeling forgettable, even when the world insists otherwise. Human memory is selective. It favors intensity, novelty, surprise. But people who grew up feeling unseen rarely offered any of these things. They were taught to soften themselves, to dim their emotional expression, to avoid becoming a burden. And when someone consistently minimizes their presence, the world eventually mirrors it back. Not because they are unworthy, but because they have become experts at being small. In psychology, this is known as self-schema formation. The mind creates an internal template, a model of who someone believes they are and how they expect others to treat them. If early experiences repeatedly whisper, "You are not remembered," the brain translates it into an identity, "I am someone people forget." This becomes the blueprint, a silent psychological script. But there is another layer, attachment patterns. Children learn about love not through explanations but through consistency. Inconsistent affection, present one day, absent the next, creates a nervous system that mistrusts emotional stability. These individuals often grow into adults with anxious or dismissive avoidant attachment dynamics, craving closeness yet expecting abandonment, wanting to matter yet assuming they never will, longing for emotional presence yet preparing for emotional absence. This contradiction creates an inner world where connection feels unstable, where memories feel conditional, where relationships feel temporary. And when people live in that emotional rhythm long enough, they begin to believe something deeply untrue: the problem must be me. Another psychological factor quietly shapes this identity: confirmation bias. The mind naturally searches for evidence that matches its existing beliefs. So when someone already believes they are forgettable, they notice every moment that supports that story. The friend who replied late, the group that moved on without them, the partner who didn't remember something important, the colleague who overlooked their contribution. They don't notice the opposite moments as easily: the people who did care, who did remember, who did reach out. Their mind filters these moments out because they don't fit the internal blueprint. This is how a single belief turns into a lifetime narrative. But perhaps the quietest force shaping this blueprint is emotional neglect, a wound often misunderstood. Emotional neglect is not about what was done. It is about what was missing. It is the absence of being understood, seen, acknowledged. It is the silence around a child's inner world, their sadness, their opinions, their desires. Children raised in emotional silence learn to mute themselves. They assume their emotions are too much or irrelevant. They grow into adults who apologize for expressing anything real. Adults who feel grateful for crumbs of attention because they never learned what consistent affection feels like. This creates what psychologists call self-erasure, a coping strategy, a survival method, a learned invisibility. They lower their voice. They shrink their expectations. They train themselves to need less so the sting of being forgotten hurts less. And yet, ironically, this self-erasure becomes the very reason they continue feeling overlooked. Not because people don't care, but because their presence is wrapped in quietness. A quietness the world doesn't always know how to notice. Over time, the internal blueprint becomes rigid. It influences how they interpret every interaction, every friendship, every relationship. If someone forgets a small detail, they take it personally. If someone doesn't reply in time, they assume emotional displacement. If someone shows closeness, they fear it's temporary. This is not dramatic thinking. It is the psychology of someone who has lived in inconsistencies. Someone who has been taught, subtly, repeatedly, that people drift away before they have the chance to stay. And so the blueprint shapes everything that follows. Their sadness becomes quieter. Their joy becomes restrained. Their expectations become cautious. They never ask to be someone's priority because they are still convinced they are replaceable. But beneath this blueprint lies a truth they don't yet fully understand. They have been living according to a story that was handed to them, not one that belongs to them. This realization, however, comes later, in the next chapter, where the inner war begins. There comes a point in every quiet person's life when the world begins to notice something they cannot name: a softness, a distant look, a hesitancy to lean fully into closeness. But on the inside, there is nothing soft about the war they carry. It is the constant tension between wanting to matter and fearing the cost of being remembered. This war doesn't explode. It contracts and withdraws. It shows up in small, habitual patterns, the ones others rarely understand. People who believe they are replaceable live in a state of emotional double exposure. Part of them yearns to be chosen, and another part prepares to vanish. They feel this conflict most intensely in relationships. Every time someone comes close, they brace themselves for the day that person will forget the little things, their voice, their presence, their significance. And so they create distance before the world has a chance to take it from them. This distance isn't dramatic. It is subtle, polite, almost invisible. They stop initiating conversations. They reply later than usual. They convince themselves they are busy, when in truth, they are protecting themselves from potential disappointment. Hyper-independence becomes their armor. Not because they want solitude, but because they learned that needing less equals hurting less. And yet, beneath all that independence lies a deep, unspoken longing, the desire to be someone's favorite place. To be held in someone's memory the way they hold others in theirs. To be the person someone refuses to forget. But longing is dangerous for anyone who fears abandonment. It feels like standing at the edge of a cliff with no certainty of the wind. To hope is to risk the fall. To care is to open the door to being replaced. So, they build emotional walls that look like strength, but are really boundaries crafted from past wounds. They tell themselves they don't need closeness, that they are fine on their own, that it's better not to expect anything. But at night, when the noise of the world fades, the truth becomes clearer than ever. They are tired of feeling invisible. Tired of being the friend who remembers everything while no one remembers them. Tired of giving effort while receiving presence only when convenient. What complicates this inner war is the presence of quiet jealousy, a form of envy they never voice because even their jealousy is soft, gentle, polite. They envy people who can take up space effortlessly. People who speak and are heard. People whose absence is noticed instantly. People who don't fear being replaced because they've never had to. This jealousy doesn't carry resentment. It carries grief. A grief for the version of themselves they never got to become, the version who felt chosen without conditions. There's also the fear of becoming burdensome. When someone reaches out to them, they analyze the gesture. Are they doing this out of obligation? Will I annoy them if I express how I feel? What if I'm the only one who feels this connection? Their mind constantly rehearses worst-case scenarios. Being forgotten, being replaced, being remembered only long enough to be discarded. This makes relationships dizzying. They hover between wanting closeness and fearing its fragility. They crave reassurance but feel guilty for needing it. They want to be loved deeply but silently assume they won't be. For many, the greatest internal conflict is this. They disappear themselves before anyone has the chance to lose them. They ghost slowly, unintentionally. Not out of malice. Out of protection. When people drift away, they don't ask why. They don't demand explanations. They simply accept it, as if it were inevitable. Because to them it is. They have lived too long believing their presence is optional, so they never question its fading. But there is a turning point that begins to grow quietly, a fragile realization that emerges only when they pause long enough to feel it. The conflict they carry was not born from truth. It was born from old patterns, old absences, old emotional echoes. And somewhere within that inner war, a soft truth begins whispering back. Maybe I was never as replaceable as I believed. Maybe I just learned to see myself through the eyes of those who didn't know how to hold me. This whisper does not yet change them. But it begins something important, a shift toward understanding. A shift that leads directly into the next chapter. The moment when they finally start to see themselves clearly. There is a moment, never loud, never dramatic, when a person who spent their whole life feeling replaceable finally pauses long enough to hear the truth beneath the noise. It doesn't arrive as confidence, or a sudden revelation, or a sweeping transformation. It begins as something softer, a quiet noticing. A shift so subtle it almost slips past them. They start to realize that the belief of being easy to forget didn't come from reality, but from the emotional landscapes they grew up in. Landscapes shaped by inconsistency, not inadequacy. By silence, not unworthiness. By absence, not lack. This realization doesn't heal them instantly, but it cracks the narrative open. For the first time, they begin to see the pattern not as a flaw, but as a story they were taught to believe. A story that never truly belonged to them. They notice how they shrink themselves, how they choose silence before expression, how they assume they matter less in every room they walk into. And instead of blaming themselves for it, they start to understand where it came from. This is the beginning of integration, the moment when a person stops confusing survival patterns for personality. Psychologically, this shift mirrors something called reattribution, the process of placing responsibility back where it belongs. They begin to understand, they were not forgotten because they lacked value. They were forgotten because the people around them lacked awareness. They were not replaceable because they were ordinary. They were replaceable because others didn't have the capacity to hold them properly. They were not invisible because they were small. They were invisible because they learned invisibility was safer. Realizing this does not erase the wound, but it reframes it. And reframing is the first step toward healing. Then something else happens, subtle but profound. They start to see how many people they carried with tenderness, while never expecting the same tenderness in return. They remember the birthdays they never forgot, the late-night check-ins they offered freely, the careful listening they gave when others needed a soft place to land. And for a moment, a new question forms, gentle but life-altering: why did I never believe anyone could offer this back to me? This question is uncomfortable. But it is transformative because it forces them to acknowledge a truth they avoided for years. They have always been capable of deep love. They have always been worthy of deep love. It was never their capacity that was lacking. It was the environments they tried to survive in. Slowly, the internal landscape changes. They stop apologizing for existing in someone's world. They begin showing up without trying to shrink their edges. They allow themselves to speak without rehearsing. They stop treating closeness as a trap and start seeing it as something they can choose rather than something they must brace against. This is not boldness, or confidence, or empowerment. It is gentler than all of that. It is the quiet reclaiming of self-worth. A worth that was never lost, only overlooked. Healing, for them, is not about becoming louder, or suddenly believing they are unforgettable. It is about recognizing the difference between being unremembered and being unworthy. It is about learning to occupy space without guilt, to let someone miss them without shame, to allow themselves to be held in memory without fearing the collapse that might follow. They begin to understand that the world's ability to forget was never a measurement of their value. It was a measurement of people's capacity, and capacity varies. Value does not. In time, they look back and see the younger versions of themselves, the quiet child, the self-erasing adolescent, the hyper-independent adult, all doing the best they could with the emotional tools they had. They see how much courage it took to keep loving others deeply even when they did not feel deeply loved in return. And this realization softens them. Not into fragility but into gentleness. A gentleness they can finally extend inward. So the story ends not with triumph but with understanding. Not with grand declarations, but with a soft truth held close. They were never easier to replace than remember. They were simply raised in places that never learned how to remember them properly. And now, slowly, quietly, steadily, they are learning to remember themselves. Before anyone else ever has to.